It's great to be here. I remember interviewing Kevin the first time. It was about 7 years ago, just around the corner from here. And what I really remember the most was how nice he was about all the dumb questions I asked. You know, it was one of my first stories on education. And, you know, if you're first wading into this subject, you are like, what is going on? Like, this is madness. And Kevin very patiently, very generously, very kindly walked me through some of the things that he'd learned and was learning over time. And I just really have enjoyed getting to know him and learning from him over the years. What I want to do today is talk a little bit about a mystery. And it's a mystery that I think should most of all give us hope in this country and in the states around this country. It's something that we've all sort of heard about in different ways. We hear about these countries that are supposedly, allegedly educating more of their kids to high levels of critical thinking and so forth and so on. And we hear that we're, 37th in the world or whatever. And we wonder, what does that mean? Does it mean anything? Does it matter? Do we want to be number one? So what I want to do, first of all, is define what I really think the issue is. Because until we can figure out what the problem is, it's hard to solve for it, right? So looking at these international challenges can be incredibly complex. I nearly lost my mind for several years working on this. The data is very, very interesting, but you have to get deep into it for it to mean anything. And most of what you get in the headlines about our ranking or whatever is not actually the interesting, most useful information. So let me first explain a little bit about where I think we are and what I think we could learn from these other countries as told through the eyes of some of the students that I followed. So if we look at one example of a gentleman, let's say that he's your average American senior citizen. And we give him a relatively sophisticated test of literacy. So not just can you read and understand what you're reading, but can you do something useful with it? Can you make a judgment? Can you make an argument? The kinds of skills we know that people need to thrive in the modern world. And the OECD did this. They went around, did a pretty large, pretty robust study of adult literacy skills that came out at the end of 2013. And it's called the PIAAC test, another terrible acronym. And it's PIAAC, in case you're wondering. But anyway, so they went around the world doing this. It's a one-on-one test, takes an hour. It's pretty thoughtful, relatively sophisticated assessment of higher order literacy skills. And what you find is really interesting if you dig into this a little bit. What you find is that our average senior citizen, when compared to senior citizens around the world, is doing pretty well. I mean, really, that's impressive, and we should feel good about that. And if you look at, let's say, your average senior citizen in some of the countries that I'll be talking about today, including, in this case, Poland, I'll be talking about. If you look at your average grandfather in Poland and give him the very same test and compare how he does compared to grandfathers and grandmothers around the world, you see that he does significantly worse, right? About 15th in the world. Okay. And the same, by the way, is true with Finland and Korea and other places. Now let's look at young Americans in their 20s, okay? If we give them the very same test and see how they do, the good news is they outperform their grandparents. So we are not getting dumber. Don't let anyone tell you that we are. She outscores her grandfather on this test. But if we compare how she does to other 20-somethings around the world, it gets more interesting. And what you see is that she does significantly worse compared to young people around the world. And her counterpart 20-something in Poland, when given the same test, does significantly better. So it's this change that's so compelling and mysterious, right? What we're finding is that we are improving in some ways, right? And I'm sure you've talked about some of that today. What we are also finding is that about 15 countries are improving much faster. And that, rather than just being nerve-wracking or frustrating, should be incredibly compelling and hopeful. Because once you've visited these places, and some of you have, I'm sure, you see that, these aren't perfect places. These aren't mystical lands of brilliant teachers and wonderful patient parents and high-achieving children of all kinds. They aren't. They are places with big political fights. They are places with big problems. And they are places that have managed to see incredible progress at a speed with which we have not. So to me, that is incredibly hopeful and the #1 reason to look at these comparisons. So then the question is, well, What have these places done, right? And what can we take from their stories? I decided to spend a year following 3 American teenagers to these countries because I knew that without the stories and the help of actual students, it was going to be very hard to glimpse beyond the data and beyond what the ministers of education wanted me to see and believe. So luckily, there are 30,000 teenagers who every year essentially switch places and go live in another country and go to a public high school and live with a host family or vice versa, come here. And they are obviously not world experts in education, thank God. They have strong opinions on their schools and their homes and their neighborhoods in the US and their schools and their homes and their neighborhoods abroad. And that, taken together with the research and what you can learn from the adults who are involved, is incredibly useful. So I want to just quickly introduce you to one of these students, who's Tom. His name is Tom, and he is from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, which is about 2 hours and a world away from here. And Tom is one of these kids who, you know, he was always just a tiny bit contrarian. You know, he was just a little bit off to the side of what everyone wanted him to be. So when he was, you might know kids like this. You might be kids like this. So when he was a kid, he, for example, when he was a little boy, he liked to play with toy soldiers. But he only wanted to play with World War II soldiers. No interest in Civil War soldiers. Now remember, he's from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, okay? If you walk around Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, you're like tripping over Civil War toy soldiers. Like it is just a shrine to the Civil War. Okay, so then as he got older, he started, you know, listening to Sonic Youth and watching Woody Allen movies. He spent a winter reading nothing but Chekhov. He got really into philosophy. Now his high school is, like a lot of American high schools, the real heartbeat of that school was its football team. And football was not something that got Tom particularly excited for whatever reason. So he decided that what he'd like to do is go spend a year in some other country in Eastern Europe where he could read philosophy in smoke-filled coffee shops. That was literally what he wanted to do, kind of a romantic idea of what life would be like in a country where maybe someone would have heard of his favorite authors. So off he went from Pennsylvania to Poland. Poland, of all the countries I visited, was the one I was most excited to get to. And the reason is that Poland is doing in real time, as we speak, what Finland and Korea and some of these other countries did decades ago. In the year 2000, Polish 15-year-olds performed below average for the developed world in math, reading, and science. By the year 2012, they were performing above average in every subject, way above their American peers. The richest Polish kids are outperforming the richest American kids. The poorest Polish kids are outperforming the poorest American kids. There now is a greater percentage of Polish kids performing at an advanced level in math than there is in Finland, which is amazing because Poland has a really high child poverty rate compared to Finland. Finland is about 4%, Poland's at 16%, approaching that of our own. When you visit Poland, you visit Wrocław, where Tom was, as I did, you know, you see it's a messy place. This is a big, sprawling, complicated country of 38 million people with a recent history of trauma and loss and dislocation and a lot of distrust for the central government. When I was there in Wrocław, the soccer team was playing its matches in stadiums that were empty of spectators because there'd been so much violence. Very surreal. And Tom's best friend had been mugged at knife point in the neighborhood where their school was located. And it was called, this neighborhood, the Bermuda Triangle. And it was called that because sometimes you went there and you just disappeared. So these are complicated places, not radically different in some ways than some of our states. And yet Poland had done 4 things in the year 1999 to 2000, 4 things that were controversial and big and bold and remain controversial today. And at the same time, they saw this dramatic progress. Poland now has a significantly higher high school graduation rate than the United States at 84%, way up above what it was when they started this journey. So I wanted to get to Poland to see what the heck was going on there. And one of the things, and I'm going to get to what they did, but one of the things that's important to know as background is that Poland spends about half what we spend per pupil on kindergarten through 12th grade education. You probably have heard that we spend more than all but 3 countries in the world on K through 12 education per pupil. But Poland is particularly striking. And so you wonder, well, what does that look like for a kid who shows up one day to some random high school in Poland? And that's Tom showing up one day to a random high school in Poland that he was assigned to. And by the way, he did manage to read philosophy in a smoke-filled coffee shop. While I was there, he took me to his favorite coffee shop, which was called Literatki, and was, indeed, there were philosophy tomes up on the shelves. And I was like, oh my God, it's really smoky in here. Like, this is crazy. I'm not used to this. I'm an American, for God's sake. So, but anyway, he loved it. He loved it. He loved all of the romance of the place and the history and the palpable sense of history that surrounds you in a place like Poland. But there were some other things that he noticed, particularly at school. When he first got to his first day of school in Wrocław, the teacher announced the latest test scores for the class. Very common, happens all over the world, including in very low-achieving countries. And what he noticed was that in that school, you got a 5 was like an A, and a 1 was like a D. And he heard a couple of 1s, he heard several 2s, he heard a bunch of 3s, a few 4s, and no 5s. And all year long, Tom waited to hear a 5. And you know, he never did. And this struck him as odd. And he tried to imagine going a year in Gettysburg High School and no one ever getting an A. And what struck him as so remarkable was actually not just the fact that no one got an A, but that the kids, after hearing this information, put their backpacks on and went to their next class. And the reason this matters is not to say, oh, well, all we have to do is just give no A's. It's to say there are these signals, millions of signals that kids get, parents get, teachers get, about how serious education is, right? These signals matter so much more than I had realized. And I want to talk more about that, but let me tell you what hundreds of exchange students told me. I ended up surveying hundreds of exchange students. I found them to be so interesting and so honest and thoughtful and non-ideological in their opinions that I ended up surveying hundreds of them to see what they thought. 9 out of 10 of the international exchange students who had lived here and gone to public school here said their US classes were easier. So I thought at first, well, 9 out of 10 is a pretty big ratio, but maybe it's just like an anti-American thing, you know, they think we're stupid, whatever. So I ended up surveying American exchange students who had lived abroad as well. And 7 out of 10 of them agreed that their US classes were easier. This is complicated. What does it mean to be easier? I mean, you could do a whole dissertation on that. And does it mean worse? Not necessarily. But when you ask exchange students what they mean, they say devastating things. They say things like, well, it just seemed like I wasn't really asked to think very much in my American school. They say, I had to do a lot of posters in my American school. They say, I love that school was not really about school. I love that it was about sports and French club and yearbook, and they do love that. And there's a lot to be said for that if learning is happening as well, right? But the kids really picked up on this, that even by the way, they love their American teachers. This is important. Exchange students I mean, I'm generalizing, but I defy you to get a group of exchange students in a room and not hear this. They say things like, I love my teachers in America. They kind of notice me. They kind of care what I might think. Sometimes they let me speak. This is an American asset that we don't talk enough about. Many, many countries around the world, kids are not allowed to speak. And that makes it easier in some ways, right? To manage a classroom. But it makes it very hard to teach kids to think for themselves, right? To become critical thinkers, to recognize patterns, to make arguments, to question things. This is a huge strength of our system when combined with rigorous learning. What else did they say? Well, this is the field outside of the school that I went to in Busan, South Korea, where an American student from Minnesota had gone for the year. You can see it's a nice school. It's very tidy. It was well respected in Busan, big booming city right on the coast of Korea. But you can see where the field ranked as far as priorities for the school. Now, to be clear, the kids loved the field. The kids were out there playing pickup soccer every chance they get. There was a group of girls who used to play badminton at lunch with rackets they brought from home and an imaginary net off in the corner. But when I asked them about it, 9 out of 10 international students said US kids place more importance on doing well in sports than kids back home. And that would be okay if more than 2% of them got college scholarships for athletics, right? That would be okay if we actually had a booming industry in professional athletics that could hire 50% of kids. But the signals that it sends are very, very confusing. 4 reporters showed up to Tom's football games, to his high school football games in Gettysburg. 4. Kids notice that. So while I've played sports all my life, my kid plays sports, I live here in DC, I send my child to DC public schools, and he would literally start screaming and pull me off the stage if he knew I were criticizing sports. It is important that we be authentic with the signals we send kids. In Finland, kids love ice hockey. They love soccer, right? But as they enter high school, they start to dial back the sports. Why do they do that? Because they're getting focused on where they're going to go to university and what kind of jobs they're going to get. So it's in the opposite direction. Another thing kids said, which I did not expect and probably wouldn't have even noticed anecdotally on my own, 7 out of 10 exchange students saw more technology in their US schools. And I dug pretty deep and finally found some data on this. You'd think there would be more, but no. And we have about a 1-to-1 computer-to-student ratio by sophomore year on average in American high schools. That's unprecedented for the whole world. So in Poland, it's 3 students for 1 computer. In Finland, it's 2 students for 1 computer, same in South Korea. And Finland and Korea, as some of you probably know, are extremely wired, digitally advanced countries. So does this mean that we should just get rid of technology in schools? Probably not, right? But again, it goes to this point of the countries that have really moved the needle have not done it through shiny objects. They have not done it by tempting kids to come to school so they can play basketball. They have done it through investing in people and investing in the training and support that they give people and investing in talent and sometimes accidentally sending kids and parents and politicians signals about the seriousness of education. So what did Poland do? Okay, so this, I know you've been waiting in suspense, wondering, what did Poland do? So here we go. There are 4 things they did. The first thing they did is they huddled up and agreed on a list of more rigorous, coherent things for kids to learn at each grade level. This is true in almost every education superpower in the world. Another thing they did, they put new standardized tests in place. Not very many, just 3 over a kid's lifetime, but they put them at strategic points, end of primary, end of beginning of middle school, and end of high school. And they found that having a more consistent, coherent, rigorous test was helpful. Did it make the difference? No. But it was good. Another thing that was important, they gave teachers a little more autonomy. Did they do this because they wanted to? They did not. They did this because they were making a huge amount of changes and needed some political capital to do so. So they gave teachers a little more freedom to pick their own textbooks, their own curriculum, et cetera. But we now know this. They didn't know it at the time. The thing that mattered the most was not any of those things, according to their own internal research of what had the biggest impact. The thing that mattered the most was something that I very rarely hear discussed in education circles in the United States. And this is true, by the way, in every country all over the world that's tried it. The longer you keep all kids together in an environment of rigorous academic expectations, the better all kids seem to do. So Finland has learned this, Korea has learned this, Poland has learned this. In 1999, they shifted the year from when kids were tracked into vocational and university track to age 16, as Finland had also done years before. Keeping kids together somehow in that environment had this effect that they really can't entirely account for. Kids who were otherwise going to go onto the vocational track, their scores on that relatively sophisticated test of critical thinking and learning, known as the PISA test, went up 100 points in 1 year. That's remarkable. And the kids who were going to the university track, their scores went up. So when I first read about this, I thought, oh, good, because we don't track. America doesn't track. Huge disappointment. Spoiler alert. It turns out we track more aggressively and earlier than most countries in the world at this point. Wasn't always true, but relatively speaking, we do. How do we do that? We do it in these stealthy ways. We have gifted and talented at age 5 based on an IQ test in some places. Then that goes to honors. Then that goes to AP. And next thing you know, you're taking totally different content in 10th grade from the kid you sat next to in kindergarten, right? We also track by zip code, don't we? We track by race and income. There's a third of African American kids attend high schools that don't even have calculus, even if they wanted to take it. That's tracking. So I was shocked to hear this. At the same time that Tom was in Poland from Pennsylvania, coincidentally, his Gettysburg High School had 3 tracks. So there was the AP track, right? Then there was the regular track. Then there was something called the applied track. That's where you get in trouble, see? So I said, well, what's in the applied track? Tom didn't even know, because lucky for him, he wasn't on that track. So when I visited his high school, I said, what's in the applied track? They said things like English in the workplace. English in the workplace. I was not aware that was a different language. Did you know? Apparently there are workplaces where you don't have to know as much. So, to his credit, Tom's new principal came in, and he said, what is this track? This is nonsense. And he just got rid of it, just took it away. And there were teachers, and some teachers, not all, some teachers, and some guidance counselors who objected, who said, our kids aren't going to make it. Some of them are going to drop out because you did this. And guess what? They didn't. They picked up their backpacks and went to the next class. So, this is a huge victory for Gettysburg High School. One that I'm not sure they got any credit for outside of my book. But I think this is the kind of thing that maybe we could talk more about. And maybe the kind of thing that, ultimately sends signals that I was talking about, right? If you say to kids, well, you can know this other kind of English that's not very hard, you'll be fine. Then one day they find out you were not correct. They find out. Increasingly, kids have to audition for their jobs, don't they? And they have to re-audition every few days to keep them. I don't care whether you're going to be a journalist or a doctor or a waitress. Your performance is going to be monitored, and it's going to be tracked, and it's going to be a ruthless world for you if you can't adapt. And it may not be fair, and it may not be nice that that's how it's going, but it's not going to go back. So when I think about what I want my own kid to do to prepare for that uncertainty, to prepare for that lifetime of auditions, I think a lot about the signals that he gets, the mixed signals that he gets about what will matter most to him. One of the things we know is that how selective you make teaching matters in these countries. Not just because it could theoretically lead to a more prepared teaching force, because it's harder to get into education college and you have a stronger academic background. Sometimes that's true, not always. This is what I didn't get until I visited these places. The selectivity and rigor of teaching college matters also because of the signals it sends. Getting into ed school in Finland is as difficult as getting into MIT in the United States today. They're accepting less than 10% of applicants. And everyone knows. This is important, right? Everyone knows. The Finnish kids I met knew how hard their teachers had worked to get into education college. And it wasn't always this way. This is the great thing about history. You can look back. In 1968, Finland had more ed schools than it needed, of wildly varying quality and selectivity, much like the United States, where we educate twice as many teachers as we need. And they shut them down and moved them to their most elite universities. And it was controversial. It was controversial. But over time, what happened is that more people wanted to be teachers because it was serious. And in the 1980s, Finland's teachers union ran an advertisement, a billboard that just said one sentence. It said, Finland has the best educated teachers in the world. That's all they had to say. When you think about what flows from that, you start to understand what I mean about signals. Kids know if teaching is serious. Kids know if education is serious. And having your president get up and say it over and over again is not the same, right? Kids are very attuned to signals. And when teachers have to work very hard and do rigorous work to get to where they are, it gives them a kind of street cred that makes the teachers' jobs easier. It makes it easier to make the case for paying teachers more, for giving them more respect and autonomy. And it creates a kind of positive feedback loop where more kids are buying into the system than before. Something that all the American kids I followed noticed. It's a subtle thing, but it's the most powerful change you can get. Kim, who came from rural Oklahoma, who'd never left the United States and had a single mother who also had never left the United States and ended up in rural Finland, she found that kids there seemed to believe that what they were doing in school all day mattered. Now, they complained about it. There were teachers they loved, teachers they hated all the tests they took, which, by the way, were not standardized tests. They were teacher design tests, but they took quite a few. And they complained about it, but they seemed to be buying into the premise that what they were doing would dramatically affect how interesting and full their lives would be. And Kim was perplexed by this because not even the kids in her honors class in Oklahoma seemed to be bought in like this. So one day she said to two of the Finnish girls during a break in classes, she said, "Why do you care so much?" Because she could tell, here's the thing, she could tell these kids were not intellectual giants. Every country I've been to, there's some kid in the back room illegally texting on his phone. Every country I've been to, the kids spend too much time on Facebook and video games. Kids are not radically different, but this difference matters. Whether kids are buying into the premise that what they do all day in school will matter. Now, here's the great irony. There is no country in the world right now that, statistically speaking, rewards you more lavishly for higher order skills than this one. And there are few countries that punish you more ruthlessly for a lack of skills, economically speaking, in cold, hard cash. Getting higher order skills in America is much more valuable in monetary terms than it is in Finland. So if any place should be able to convince its kids that this matters, it's this place, because the facts are on our side. But the signals we send have to be authentic and honest. You know, there are states that have tried to do this. There are people who are trying to change these signals right now. And it is like pushing against the cultural grain, isn't it? It's uncomfortable. It's controversial. When Deborah Gist took over as in charge of Rhode Island's education system, the first thing she learned, one of the first things, was that they had the lowest cut score in the nation for getting into teacher college, so the lowest SAT or ACT score. And because she could, she immediately changed it to the highest in the nation. And she got a lot of pushback, a lot of really valid concerns, particularly from teacher colleges, who felt like they were going to end up with a whiter, less diverse workforce than they had before because they'd raised the standards. And there were a lot of concerns about this. So Deborah, she implemented it over time. She said, send me a waiver if you have a great student who you think doesn't have the test scores, would be a great teacher. I want to hear about that person. When I checked back 2 years after implementation, she'd gotten 0 waiver requests. And when I called the major ed school there, they checked their records, and guess what? The percentage of minority enrollment had slightly increased. It was still too low. It was too low before she started, because they weren't really, in my view, aggressively trying to recruit minority candidates. So I think we have to decide what we are more afraid of, right? What mistake are we more afraid of making? We have a lot of boogeymen in this country, don't we? Every country does. We seem to have extra. And we have to decide which ones we're more afraid of. But in my view, it is so important that we be honest with kids while there's still time for them to change, while there's still time for them to do better. And that we set the people who teach them up to do the hardest job in the country. Because that's what it is. You know, my mother was a teacher. I always said, oh, teaching's so important, teaching's so hard. But until I really spent time in classrooms, I didn't get it. I didn't get the intellectual chess match that is great teaching. I didn't get that in an average day, as Elizabeth Green writes in her new book, in an average day, your average American teacher makes many, many more decisions than your average American physician. So giving teachers a full year of mentoring in a classroom with a strong, experienced teacher, as Finland does, that matters, right? And it sends a signal that this is for real. And this is something that I feel like we should talk more about. What do I know? I'm just the schmuck reporter. But I do notice when I travel to these countries that these signals are so powerful, that they matter a lot. You know, in Japan, they have public lesson studies where, for the big ones, thousands of teachers come from all over the country to watch a teacher teach a class. And that's important. And equally important is the debrief, the post-game that comes after, where they talk about what happened there, and why wasn't this one student getting this concept, and what could we have done differently? And that is the intellectual work of great teaching. And you know, why don't we do that here? And maybe, you know, because Japan doesn't need to build more cultural capital around rigorous education, but we do. So maybe you have a big public lesson with a great teacher. We got a bunch of them right here in this city. And maybe you invite the public. Maybe you invite parents, because they don't know. And no one's telling them what teaching looks like for real. And no one's really asking for their help. One of the things that I've noticed as a parent is that the only time I get robocalls from my kid's principal, you know, those automated calls, anyone get these from their kid's principal or their school system? You know, I get that. It shows up like principal. I'm like, oh, God, what's my kid done? You know, my heart stops. I pick it up. You've got my attention. You've got my attention. And you know what those robocalls say? They say, Wednesday is Chipotle night. Go to Chipotle, and if you buy a burrito, 10% or whatever will go to the school. So before I wrote the book, I got this call, and I was like, all right, well, I'll put it in my calendar because education's important. So I got to do this. That is literally how we think. I mean, I'm serious. I'm busy, you know what I mean? But my principal calls, I'm like, I'm going. So we go to Chipotle night. There's 500 people lined up around the corner. It's 1,000 degrees. I'm pretty sure my kid's going to get hit by a car while we're waiting. I get it, but once you tell a kid you're going to Chipotle, you can't be like, never mind. You can't dial it back. So we're there for 45 minutes. I finally get there, I order my burrito, whatever, 50 cents goes to the school for God knows what. And I get home, and you know what happens when I get home? I collapse on the couch. Do you think I read to my kid that night? No. But it's okay, because I've already done my part, haven't I? So I've never gotten a robocall reminding me to read to my child and maybe giving me a good tip about how to do it right. Because I didn't know until one of his teachers said to me, when you read to him, ask him questions. What's going to happen next? Why is that kid crying? Why did the author choose that word instead of another? Guess what? It makes it a lot more interesting for you. But I didn't know that. Nobody's called me and in 30 seconds told me that. 30 seconds. There's a study just came out, Stanford, big study, hundreds of people, where they sent parents practical text messages like that about literacy. And guess what happened when they send parents messages like that? Literacy improves. It's like a miracle. So this year I got the Chipotle call. Delete. I did not go to Chipotle, but I did read to my kid. These countries are calling their parents and telling them to read to their kids and how to do it in so many ways. They are using their parents as force multipliers for their teacher, making their teachers' jobs easier. You don't have to be a genius to help your kid. You don't have to be a genius to send signals that are true and authentic and valuable for their actual lived lives. In a study of 13 very different countries all over the world in 2008, the more time parents spent volunteering in PTAs and extracurricular activities, the worse their kids did on a test of critical thinking by age 15 in reading, even after controlling for socioeconomic differences. Same study, more time parents spent reading to their kids and asking them questions about their day, talking to them about movies, books, TV, the better their kids did in a test of critical thinking and reading by age 15, even after controlling for income differences. So there's some things, despite all our fights and all of our angst and all of our boogeymen, there's some things that we're not even trying. Not the way we should. And those signals really matter. And increasingly what you find, I love this quote, it's, you know, I just had to put it in here because I read it the other day in the New York Times Magazine. This is an author and physician. We can argue all day long about whether it's fair to compare our kids to kids in Finland and Korea. Interesting arguments to have. I can go all night, anytime. Guess what? It's already happening. And whether or not they're going to get jobs or whatever, once you know it can be done, you have a moral imperative to do it. And these countries are getting it done. I think we have 5 minutes for questions. I want to thank you all so much for being here and for listening. Thank you. We have a mic here. Thank you. So I think if anyone has a question, I think we have a mic up front, and we can go ahead, and I think we've got just a few minutes here. Yes?
Thank you very much. Great presentation. And I just want to let you know I'm never going to volunteer at my kids' school again. Ever.
I know. I'm really going to get busted for this one day, I know.
I mean ever. Talk about the parental drive in those two countries and the differences you saw versus American parents.
So parental involvement in education leads to better outcomes all over the world. That's very clear. Turns out the kind matters. So when I asked, there was a parent and teacher that I got to know pretty well in Finland, and I asked her, so what is your kid's school, elementary school, age kids, just like mine, what does your kid's school ask you to do? And she said, what do you mean? And I said, like, as a parent, how are you supposed to get involved? She said, oh, they really like it if I bring my kids to school on time. And I said, okay, what else? You know, do they ask you for money? And she was like, no, that would be no. And I said, did they ask you to, like my school asked me to come hand out silverware at the cafeteria at lunch? And she was like, no, why, no? And then I said, do they ask you to do this, do that, do this? And she said, that sounds kind of fun. I wish they asked me to do that stuff, but no. One of the things you notice is that you don't see parents in schools in places like Finland and Korea. You don't see them, and it's not because they don't care about education. I mean, in Korea, this is like a extreme obsession. They care. I mean, they're going to, like, you know, temples to pray for their kid to do better on a test. Like, they care. But they're asked to be involved at home. And we all have limited time, and we all need priorities and help setting those priorities, right? And so we look to our school leaders and our kids' teachers to help us set those priorities. And I actually think that American parents are more involved than if I had to guess, there's not good data on this, but if I had to guess, I think they're very involved compared to parents around the world. I just don't think they're typically involved in things that lead to learning. So I think those are good things, good community building, fun building things that are important, and sometimes it's nice to have money from Chipotle. But I don't think that those things lead to learning. So the focus that we need could come partially through clearer signals to parents. Any other thoughts? Anyone want to argue with me about Chipotle or sports? Sports is a good one.
This was fantastic. I am a principal, so you've given me a lot to think about regarding robocalls. I appreciate that. I'm really intrigued. You've said signals a lot. And you've mentioned, you know, a president sort of refraining the importance of education as not effective, but a billboard as effective. So can you unpack a little bit, you know, what makes a great signal? What are you really talking about?
That's interesting. So part of this is about authentic, honest messages, right? That have a way of telling kids what will matter in the future now. Because our kids do find out that what they're doing in school matters, but they find out when they're like 27, right? And it's late. And we do this out of the goodness of our hearts, you know? There was a girl that I followed who had lived for various reasons, half in the US and half in South Korea. Poor kid kept getting taken back and forth. She's Korean by birth and grew up there until like age 10, and then was in Lincoln, Nebraska. And she finally ended up in New Jersey, and she said, you know, on her first math test, she noticed something odd. She noticed that one of the kids in the class had a question. This is in high school. By this point, she'd come back to the US. And the girl raised her hand and asked the teacher a question about one of the test questions. And the teacher kind of tried, you know, to reframe the question so she'd understand. And she kept pushing the student, kept asking for more. And eventually, while Jenny was sitting there, she realized that the teacher was giving her the answer to the question. And that comes from good intentions, right? Like, he wants to help her. He wants her to succeed, right? But what Jenny thought was, is he going to be there when she takes the SAT? He is not. So whatever we can do to tell kids stories, to bring alumni back who can tell you what they realized when they were 27, who can tell you what it feels like when you get placed in remedial English even though you were a straight-A student in high school, who can tell you that actually, I had to take a test to get my first job in math, even though I didn't think I needed to know math. Even though I had a college degree, I had to take a test. Who can help kids connect the dots. I think other students, recent students, are a great device for those signals, right? And for making them clear. Because one of the things that we have a lot of strengths in this country, as I mentioned. One of the things we don't have is focus in education. We don't have a clear consensus around what the goals are and how to get there. So signals are important, I think, and particularly if they're creative. In Korea, when the kids take their university entrance exam, like the SAT, the stock market opens an hour late so they can clear up the road so there won't be too much traffic for the kids. So you think of the signal that sends. Now, I'm not saying we want to do that necessarily, but it'd be nice if the stock market could take a real hit in some way. I think that would be, like if the most powerful people in the country pause to recognize the hard, important work that kids and teachers are doing, I don't know what form that would take, but I throw that out there. I think that would be awesome. In Finland, the university entrance exam lasts 50 weeks, 50. I'm sorry, 50 hours. 50 hours. 50 hours over 3 weeks. You're like, what? 50 hours over 3 weeks. They don't have, this is their only standardized test. This is it. But it's no joke. There are whole days of writing. The whole day you just write answers to one question. Like one of the recent ones was, why has there been no lasting peace in the Middle East? That's a rigorous test, my friends. Right? We ain't got no tests like that. I don't care. I don't care what state you're going to be like. New York? No. No. And the signals matter. Kids pick up on those things. And I know we worry. We're worried we're going to crush their spirit. They're going to fail. So here's the thing. The signals have to be combined, right, with a mindset that says if you fail, it's because you didn't work hard enough and get enough help. And there are signals you can send around that, too. I could go on all day. Last example I'll give you is there was a school I learned about in a book about parenting around the world. And it was in Japan. And when their opening day, instead of celebrating successes and all the great things that were going to happen, and what they would do, one of their traditions was to bring up one of the most successful kids in the school and have him talk or her talk about things that they tried to do and failed at the year before. So this one kid got up and he talked about how he wanted to break the swimming record, but he tried this, tried that, but he didn't, and here's his new plan for next year. And so there are these ways, and I think storytelling, I'm biased, but I think storytelling is a very powerful way to back up what you say, I mean, I was reading a lot about the importance of getting kids comfortable with productive struggle and failure. And I came home, I read something that you should ask your kids at dinner, what did you fail at today? As a way to kind of normalize this. So I came home and I sat down at dinner and I was all ready. And I turned to my kid, he was 7, and I said, what'd you fail at today? And he looked right back at me without missing a beat. He said, what'd you fail at today? And I was like, I couldn't come up with anything. So I started taking Spanish lessons. He's at a Spanish bilingual school, and I figured, for God's sake, I could learn some Spanish, really. And guess what? Learning another language is a great way to fail all the time. And so he could laugh at my terrible accent, and every night I had a story about failure. And he realized that, as adults, we can get very much in our comfort zone, right? And get used to not failing. And we forget how uncomfortable kids are all the time, and they're actually much better at that than we are. And so I think showing them, one way to have signals, I guess, to finally wrap it up, is to do it yourself. So that same study I mentioned about parenting around the world, parents who read on their own for pleasure, regardless of socioeconomic status, had kids who did better on that test of critical thinking and reading by age 15. So instead of going to Chipotle, you just read on your own for pleasure, and your kids will be smarter. There you go. Thank you very much.